So I got this question 5 days ago from Wesker Willie 9044 asking the question, I gotta ask, are you really sure Arabs were part of the school of thought that inner Africans were primitive because they do not have some of the earliest because they do have some of the earliest contact with African societies? I think it was a European thing by and large. And personally speaking, I also think that the Portuguese didn't have this type of thinking too. That is an interesting question, and the answer is more complicated than anybody thinks. For example, let's take Ibn Battuta for example. We have no idea what he looked like and what race he was, but generally he is depicted as a light skinned Berber by modern scholars. He, in writing, wrote that most African civilizations were pretty civilized and were connected with the rest of the world, citing black Africans in China, even events. He actually shows how complicated this answer is. It sounds simple, but he actually shows by stating that he went to Egypt, which is what's being depicted in this picture. He went to Egypt, met black people in Egypt, right? And when he was on the Nile, he saw a black African, which he was scared to approach, but then he did. And when he got on next to a raft, the black man didn't want him to pass by him and made him walk very close to him. He, after looking at this man, like, what's he trying to do, realized that he was protecting him from crocodiles. The black man was putting himself in between the boat and the crocodile because the black person was able to fight off the crocodile, whereas Ibn Battuta wasn't even aware that there was crocodiles in the Nile. Now, this is only one encounter, but he had several. He mentions genius black people or magicians in Persia. He mentions seeing black people from Africa in India. One of his accounts makes it seem like he is very surprised by how impressive black people are who travel around the world and how educated they are and their centers of learning. So, in the case of Ibn Battuta, it is true that he did not look down on black Africans. But if you take someone like Ibn Hawkal, if you take someone like really a huge line of people, Al Masudi is another one, you will see racism everywhere because of two things. Ibn Battuta traveled all over the world, and so he had a good view of different people around the world, and he was able to say, oh, I see, I see. So in every civilization, you have the smart crowd, you have the middling crowd, and then you have the lower class, which is uneducated. And he looked at them differently than any other normal person would. Al Masudi had the same thing, except that when ignorance creeped in other words, when he didn't know who was in a certain location, he would insert ignorance. He'd be like, okay, the people living this place are dumb. The people living in this place, according to Galen, which I don't know where they get this idea from, but according to Galen, Africans are blah 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 blah. I'm not gonna repeat it. Like he says some of the craziest stuff about black Africans. Now regarding the Portuguese are easily some of the most racist people to come to Africa, especially early. I mean, one of their quotes were, the people of the Kingdom of Congo are beautiful because their skin is not as tanned as the people of Nubia, who resemble something more like an animal than humans. By the way, that's another quote by other Muslim scholars where they would compare the lifestyle, at least they weren't comparing the people, but they would compare the lifestyle of some human beings to animals. If we go back, if we reverse and we go to something like the Romans or the Greeks, we can see that they didn't have any racist ideas about Black Africans. Now, that is sort of the long answer. The short answer is racism in the West against Black people was built first and foremost by Muslims in the East. Every trope that you see, every repeated racist idea, the whole comparing to animals, the whole Shamham and Japheth, everything that you see is taken out of the Islamic world. And that's no surprise because, again, like I've said before, every other thing that they learned, every other thing that they learned from the period of the golden age of Islam onwards came from the Middle East, even though a lot of that information was based off of ancient Egypt and was based off of Rome and Greece and places like that. They built it off of the backs of the Middle Easterners and they copied every idea, good or bad. Even some of the names that would later be used to describe people of all kinds come from Middle Eastern words. Another question I got is very enlightening. I need to look into those Cameroonian sites. Also, a pity we don't have the architectural traditions of the Nok culture. And the answer is we actually might have a lot of architecture of the Nok culture, but that will have to wait for another video. What we do have, though, is post Nok civilizations. So we have Bornu civilizations, we have Kanem civilizations, some of the oldest architecture from Chad and Nigeria goes back to about 500 BC. So it's very likely that we actually do have this, but again, we need more excavations. A lot of these places were not considered that interesting by a lot of people for a long time. So we need to go through these times. Another comment I got was, I'm surprised you didn't mention the crowns for kingdoms on this map. I also saw ruins like this in Nigeria, somewhere in the plateau or Adamawa state. I remember seeing it on a YouTuber vlog. The map that he's talking about is this one. And yes, I do think it would have added a little more context if I had mentioned the crowns. As you can see, Kilwa, there's a crown with a mace, I guess, a gold mace. And in Regionum, you can see it. In Nuba, you can see it. If you go to Mali in West Africa, Mali, you can see it. All over West Africa, you can see it. These are supposed to represent kingdoms or great kingdoms. So yeah, I should have probably mentioned that, but I'll be honest, I was more interested in the literature at the time more than I was the actual picture itself. It does, though, paint a different image about what the people saw at this time. And it does remind us that not all Portuguese, going back to the first question, not all Portuguese or Europeans or anybody thought that the world of the Africans was some backwards area, but instead they saw them as typically equals. One of the things that I like watching are documentaries about Japan. And one of the things that irritates me is how much emphasis they have on saying that the Portuguese, when they got to Japan, they couldn't believe how sophisticated they are because no civilization they ran into before they got to Japan was so well managed and so well organized and so clean and blah blah blah. But every civilization they ran into before they got to Japan shocked them, and they write that in their books, like, yo, you should see this place, Kilwa. You should see this place, Mali. You should see this place, um, Nuba. You should see Egypt. You should see China. You should see India. You should see Indonesia or Java. But if you watch the documentary about Japan, it makes it seem like, yo, this is the first time we've ever run into equals. This is the first time we've ever run into people who we can say 100% are sophisticated. But, that is so weird. And also another thing that I hate about those documentaries is they make it sound like the Japanese people as well, the first foreigners they ever saw were the Portuguese, which is not true. And in fact, I think the reason why they called the Portuguese the Southern Barbarians was because that's kind of what they called the Chinese who would come into their countries. But, that's something else. And again, we must remember that the people, even as far as West Africa, were capable of going to China. An interesting comment I got when I talked about how some of the people, in order to cross the Sahara Desert, would bury things within the areas, which of course you have to bury it deep, otherwise the wind's going to move it. But this is an interesting comment because, I know this, through direct experience. I mean, I've seen this happen in real life, but it said, I remember watching a documentary about how Africans would put water in ostrich shells and bury them along certain routes. This is probably referring to the Khoisan people, who, by the way, the Khoisan are the peak of native intelligence. When you watch around the world, obviously there's other people like Native Americans and all these other people, but these people shocked the world in what they do. For example, when hunting, they don't use nets like you find in East African tribes. They track animals. In other words, they look at footsteps and they calculate the wind, they set up traps, and they basically, you can see that they're using their brain like they were living in the modern world in order to catch things. And they show us very deeply how or why the people in the past were not just, they were just ignorantly living. Instead, they used all of their brain to do stuff. Think about this. This is why animals stood no chance against human beings. You've got someone who can design an iPhone, and they're using every single part of their brain, not to design an iPhone, but to catch you, some random animal that's running around. So in the digging process, they would bury things, not just ostrich eggs, by the way. They would bury um, they would bury roots. So they would dig up roots or dig up fruits, and they would bury them sometimes. They would plant, by the way, they would plant some things in certain areas and just leave them there. Things like planting, not meaning like planting it so it can grow, but putting it in the ground. They would plant weapons in certain areas, so you don't need to carry them the entire way. They would bury clothes in certain areas. All of this is because they're as intelligent as any modern human being, except they live in a natural environment. This is why one of the debates that I saw on another show was, some people say, oh, I could live forever. Like if the world crashed and fell to bits, some people are like, oh, I could live in the wild forever and nothing bad would happen to me. I'd probably live better than a lot of the natives? And the answer is no, you can't. The elements would kill you, first of all. You ever, I mean, some people probably know this. You ever like somewhere and it's cold and there's no electrical help to help you get away from the cold, and already your life feels miserable just because you're cold? These people know how to get away from that. And that's just cold. So you've got the natural elements coming at you. You've got bugs that are not scared of you. They will climb on you while you're sleeping. You have um animals, real animals trying to kill you. You have poisons, you have snakes. While you're walking, you have thorns, some of which are poisonous, which you will step on and die. You have all kinds of things like that. The reason why human beings, part of the reason why, even if they moved to a completely new location, they survived, is because they would bring 500 people and they would learn from the 20 that died. Like, okay, don't eat that fruit. Make sure you boil that. Make sure you burn that. Throw away the dead. Make sure you don't eat around the dead. Don't leave dead bodies everywhere. It's because of these people that actually a lot of the later cultures that would come in this specific region would have very similar standings. And in fact, I believe, because we found DNA evidence in the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe that shows that they were a mix between Bantu people and the Khoisan people, these people, so two black tribes that came together. I believe it's because of their strategies that that kingdom became, first of all, a bow and arrow wielding, amongst people who use spears and swords and stuff, a bow and arrow wielding, world traveling. In other words, they didn't just stay in one place, they moved around, traded with everybody, including Khoisan people. I think the addition of Khoisan type people within the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe is probably why it's a standout, even in the Swahili coast, which is hard to do. It's very difficult to defeat the Swahili coast in terms of sophistication. You're talking about the highest level of construction. The buildings are unbelievable in those regions. Another comment I got was, yes, finally, which I'll give you the context. He was referring to the fact that for a lot of my videos, I showed prehistoric civilizations in West Africa instead of showing the big architectural buildings and all of that. But, I did that on purpose because most channels, they just start showing the Kingdom of Mali out of nowhere. And without historical context, without looking backwards, all you get is comments like, well, where did it come from? How did it come? It must have been some foreign intervention, right? And that's why I have to do the boring work of laying down the actual historical events that led to them having civilizations. Because, of course, there is a large amount of evidence that can show us that they had giant buildings built in ways that would later be part of greater constructions. And we can even talk about how these rampants and, the walls of Benin that became the greatest walls known to the earth until modern roads, the longest stretching connected walls until modern roads. You can't just start there. You can't. It doesn't work. I've watched a lot of those documentaries and it leaves me empty because it doesn't answer the question of where the hell did that come from. Like I said with the Egypt question, it's like starting the conversation of Egypt when the Greeks take over, which, by the way, they start there. A lot of people start there. A lot of people, the first thing they learn about Egypt is Cleopatra. And it's like, whoa, some people are surprised when you say that there were way more men dominating Egypt than females. Then they're like, wait a minute, how does that make sense? What about Cleopatra? It's like, that's one person. One person in 4,000 years of history. By the way, I want to point out something that I said in one of my other videos, which is, and I think this adds a lot of context as well. You read what the Moor from Spain said about West Africa, that it's the sister's child that takes over rather than the child of the king himself. This is very typical in Africa. It's called matrilineal societies. This is what connects Africa in the long run. And even Egypt, to some degree, is considered matrilineal, in that inheritance comes from the female side rather than the male side. Another question I got is this: where are all the monuments that should exist during West Africa's medieval centralized governments? For a while, West Africa had some of, if not the most richest and powerful empires in the world, with very centralized governments. Less richer, less powerful, less scholarly societies built monuments that can still be seen today. Where are the West African monuments? And nobody should point at those adobe castles, palaces, and mosques. Those would have been extremely low budget of for the wealth we know existed at the time. Well, I mean, here you have ruins of the foundations showing monuments from Kanem or Kanem Bornu, but this is Kanem before the Bornu addition to it in Chad. This goes back maybe 2,000 years. So they're everywhere. Of course, you can even look at places like Mali or Mauritania if you'd like. There's multiple of them prior to Islam, prior to the invasions. Um, they're all over, Cameroon. We find them there. They're in Nigeria, Ghana. I mean, there's a mosque, which, I guess you don't want an idea of a mosque, but there's a mosque in Ghana which is considered the Medina or the Mecca of the West because it's such a big mosque. It was built in 1650, and you know, pictures aren't that good at depicting images, because of scale. But if you look right at the corner, you can see a donkey there, which will tell you how tall this building really is. Also, there's a tree in the back for scale. But Ghana had giant mosques everywhere. Everywhere you look at West Africa, everywhere there's giant buildings representing the ancient world, and of course, not the earthen ramparts that circulate Benin. By the way, for all of you who are watching, my point has been proven. This is why I had to go back in history. My point has been proven. If you start with the Muslims, if you start in the very times later, people are gonna say, well, that's Muslim creations. That's the creation from the Muslims. They created that. That's influence from Muslims. Now, I mean, you could tell by here that this architectural style has got nothing to do with Islam. It's got nothing to do with Arabs. It's got nothing to do with it. This is pure African design. But, if you don't show earlier designs that have nothing to do with Islam, then people are going to just blame it on other people except the people who are in Africa. Because of this conversation or this comment, There was a whole debate going on in my comments about adobe or any of that. And it doesn't matter because West Africans built with all kinds of materials different from one another. Like I said, there's drywall, then there's clay, baked walls in Mauritania. They baked clay. Then there's sandstone that was used. Then there's, all kinds of stones were used. I mean, if you look at the Canum regions, those rocks, that's not soft. That's not nonsense. That's real. That's a real architecture. And it goes back a long time. Also, you'll see that in Wikipedia now, because of new findings, people are starting to speculate that the Tumalus that you find, or Tumalai that you find in West Africa, are connected to the pyramids in terms of motivation. So if we read here, preceded by assumed earlier sites in eastern Sahara, tumuli with megalithic monuments developed as early as 4700 BC in the Sahara region of Niger. Ferki Hassan indicates that the megalithic monuments in the Sahara region of Niger and eastern Sahara may have served as an antecedent for the mastabas and pyramids of ancient Egypt. The prehistoric traditions of monarchic tumuli buildings is shared by both West African Sahel and the Middle Nile regions. Ancient Egyptian pyramids of the early dynastic period and the Meroitic Kush pyramids are recognized by Faraji as part of and derived from an earlier architectural Sudanic Sahelian tradition of monarchic tumuli, which are characterized as Eastern pyramids or proto pyramids. Faraji, 2022, characterized Nobadia as the last pharaonic culture of the Nile Valley and described Mount Tumuli as being the first architectural symbol of sovereign's return and reunification with the primordial mound upon his death. Faraji indicates that there may have been a cultural expectation of post-mortem resurrection associated with the tumuli in the funerary traditions of West African Sahel, northern Ghana, northern Nigeria, Mali, and the Nile Valley. Balana Kustal Kerma Kush, based on artifacts found in the tumuli from West Africa and Nubia. There may have been a highly developed cooperative ritual in which the family members of the deceased brought various items of offerings and tribute to ancestors buried in the tumuli, and the tumuli may have served as immense shrines of spiritual power for the populace to ritualize and remember their connection to the ancestral lineage as consecrated in the royal tomb. For anyone watching, drop a like, share, chat, donate, even if it's less than $1. I don't care for the video because we need to keep going up. But let's go back to the tumuli. As you can see, the tumuli inspired all kinds of things. And I actually left out a part in the video when I was doing the 300 BC to about 300 AD era of West Africa, where one of the ancient sources states that some of the people in East Africa, when when someone is dead, they bury them and then they start throwing rocks over his body. In other words, a tumuli in in East Africa. So this is a long stretching tradition that goes all the way from Ethiopia all the way to Egypt to the West African regions. Do you really want me to leave this information out when we know it could be a huge connector to one of the greatest monuments on earth? Is that really boring? Is that really not information you want to know about? That the pyramids, which seem to have no equal around the world, which are based off of the dead, have comparisons or real comparisons in West Africa, which they're not built of wood, they're not built of sand, they're not built of anything else except stones, which were not typically used for houses in any of these regions when these were first discovered. And that the mastabas that I show you, those early constructions themselves started as tumuli and then were constructed into mastabas when Egypt became a little more sophisticated. And then from those mastabas, they became pyramids because it was just mastaba over mastaba over mastaba over mastaba, creating the step pyramid. And from there, they were like, hey, we can actually build a real pyramid. Is that something that we should leave out when other people, even Egyptian scholars, are now looking at it like, hey, that's probably all connected. And if it is connected, Sahara Sahalan connections, if they all are connected, that would then give ground for the connection of the Afro-Asiatic languages, give ground for the connection of those languages in general, and might make other so-called Afrocentrics from the past very correct about what they said. I've already said like, share, and subscribe, so thank you very much. See you when I talk about canon.